So my talk is about new information we're getting about the peopling of the Americas through multiple migrations. This is very international knowledge that's coming up. It includes archaeology, anthropology, genetics, linguistics, climatology, ecology, cultural geography, glaciology, and so on. And I have tried to wrap my head around some of those things to bring together knowledge from different fields, especially the new knowledge that they're getting now in Siberia because of climate change, and also in Northern Europe. So the Scandinavians and the Russians are contributing a lot of new research. So I'm basically aiming to show how people could have migrated to the Americas from common centers of origin by traveling both east and west around the Arctic Circle and over the Arctic Ocean, and that this could have happened both before, during, and after the last glacial maximum, which nowadays they are referring to as marine isotopic stage 2. But if you don't mind, I'm just going to say LGM for the last glacial maximum. Will that be all right for the purposes of this? And the people came not only by Beringia, but because there apparently were a lot of land bridges in the Arctic at that time. And I was led to this investigation by realizing that a trans-Arctic migration would actually help explain the age and distribution of pre-Clovis cultures that we have here, and would also help to explain the unique DNA signatures that we find in northeastern North America. So that was how I got into this. So these were the research questions that I started out with. What are the theories of migration? Would it even have been possible to come over the Arctic? Why would people ever have wanted to do such a thing? Is there any evidence of them having done so? If so, who were they? Where did they come from and when? Because there's a question about the real age of occupation of the Americas. And then, is there any supporting evidence for any of this from population genetics, physical anthropology, historical linguistics, and so on? So you could see that one question led to another, and it got a little complicated. Let's see. So these are the theories and hypotheses that we have so far that framed my inquiry. At first, Beringia was the only proposed route from Northeast Asia. And the problem is that we have sites that are much older. Plus there's a gap of 10,000 years or so between the time that people arrived in Beringia and the time that they left Beringia for North America, although that's an open question because we occasionally find new dates that reduce that 10,000 year gap for the standstill or the incubation. It may not even be necessary for there to have been an incubation period because they now have a date of 24,000 years ago for Bluefish Caves 2 in Alaska. So that is open to change always. And then an earlier Pacific coast migration was proposed. And at first that lacked evidence, but now we do have evidence for a very early migration, sites in British Columbia and in Washington State. So that is also changing. Then we had, I think it's Erlandson who gave it the nickname of the Kelp Highway. And then we have Bradley and Stanford's migration theory going across the North Atlantic, the so-called Solutrean hypothesis. The route has actually gained some acceptance, interestingly, but remains controversial. And then, we realize from genetic evidence that there have to have been multiple migrations. At no time was there any single migration of any single population from Beringia. You simply cannot account for the genetic diversity in the Western Hemisphere with that as a basis. And then there's also the realization that the archaeological evidence cannot all be accounted for unless you consider different migration routes, including back migrations. So it turns out to be a more complex picture than we thought, than we thought of in the past. Since this map was made, the dates for the migration of Beringia have been pushed back first to 16,000, and now, as I've just mentioned, possibly even to 24,000. Originally, people were supposed to have been incubating in Beringia at the Beringia standstill between 26,000 years ago and 16,000 years ago. So now that may change. So as not to. Then there's the inland route east of the Rocky Mountains via the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets. And the problem with the corridor apparently is that it was not viable until around 12,500 years ago, leaving again a 10 or 12,000 year gap between Alaska and the rest of the United States, and still with even older dates to the south and to the east. So there's discontinuity there. And the box on the left shows, the black box on the left shows the sites that have now been confirmed for maritime adapted people taking the coastal route. It's also been proposed that people followed bison and mammoths into the high plains of North America via the northern shores of Beringia. Beringia was a wide landmass, and there were different coastlines of Beringia. The northern coastline of Beringia would take you into the Canadian Arctic and onto the Canadian Shield, which apparently also had some ice-free land and periglacial sea routes. I think Dennis O'Rourke first proposed that people reach the Atlantic coast from Beringia by that route, which is the red lines on this map. And he gave me permission to use this map and supports my work on the subject. But I'm proposing even more of an Arctic route to the Atlantic in addition to these other routes. So when we have the North Atlantic route proposed by Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford, in which people came by boat from Refugia on Spain's Cantabrian coast to the mid-Atlantic coast of North America by following the edges of seasonal ice packs in the North Atlantic, hunting marine mammals all the way. And this is referred to as the Solutrean migration, referring to an upper European Paleolithic tool tradition, and I'll come back to that. Bruce has corresponded with me about his work, and he also supports my thesis. Not that that's any excuse, I'm just saying. Now, interestingly, this is a map from a recent issue of a National Geographic magazine, and it shows for the first time a general acceptance of the possibility that people may indeed have come from the east in an east to west migration to the Atlantic coast, and not just from the west via Beringia. This map also reflects the latest ideas about multiple migrations and back migrations, by the way the arrows go. Oceanic migration routes have also been proposed between West Africa and Brazil, and between Polynesia and South America. But there's just not enough evidence. There's actually no evidence so far to go by. The only thing is the Austro-Melanesian genetic signatures in South America. They could be explained as an artifact of the Pacific coast migration. And the African genetic signatures in South America, if they're confirmed as not linked to the international slave trade, could be explained as an artifact of the Atlantic coast migration. So my thesis is that people representing divergent gene pools traveled from the same source, both east and west around the Arctic Circle, via land bridges and island archipelagos that existed before and during the LGM, when the sea level was greatly lowered. So and on this map, all the brown, red, orange, and yellow areas were exposed land. They were very often unglaciated and vegetated, according to the latest reports from the Russian scientists, and they could have supported such a migration. So Trans-Arctic routes would add these green lines to the National Geographic's map, if we got there. Now, if we look at a polar map projection, this is looking at the North Pole as the center. It shows the traditional interpretation of the extent of glacial ice during the last ice age. This is what we always thought, that the whole place was covered with ice, miles deep, and it's referred to as the Pan-Arctic ice sheet theory. It shows both the oceanic and continental glaciers completely covering the whole top of the world. And it was that way during one of the earlier glacial periods, but it turns out that it wasn't that way during the LGM. The LGM, or Marine Isotopic Stage 2, went from 29,000 years ago to 14,000 years ago and peaked at 22,000 years ago. And at that time, there was a floating ice sheet over the Western Arctic, and there were continental glaciers, the Westlerian in Eurasia and the Wisconsin in North America, like this. But it turns out that the Arctic ice sheet and the continental glaciers did not merge, and there was unglaciated land at the edges of all those continental shelves, island chains, and microcontinents that were formed by sea level drop all around the Arctic Circle, more like this. And new studies of the seafloor that have been made possible by global warming and undertaken by the Russian scientists and others indicate that these areas were land that was not covered by glacial ice during the last glacial period. They include, I suppose, if I can see what, there. They include the Altai Plateau, part of the Tamar Peninsula, the part of the Laptev seafloor, all of these islands that come along here, the Severmaya, Franz Josef Land, and Svalbard, the northwestern coast of Norway and its continental shelf, which went way out into the Norwegian Sea and is now underwater. The Icelandic ice shelf, where it connects with the Norway's ice shelf, all of these continental shelves. Greenland, and in the North Greenland, Ellesmere Island, down both sides of Hudson Bay. So there was quite a lot of territory to walk on. So a trans-Arctic migration route would have been physically possible for both animals and humans. And according to the more scientists from other fields, there was also food for them to eat en route. And I thought that was particularly fascinating. These are some of the images from those studies. This map, let me just see, did I skip a map? No, okay. This study shows the gray represents the present coastline. The red areas are only 50 meters below present-day sea level. They would have been exposed during the LGM. And it's the same for the orange and the yellow areas, which are all under 150 meters below sea level and would have been exposed. And even for some of the very light green areas in the Chukchi Sea and in the Northeast Atlantic and Northwest Atlantic. The arrows show very strong currents between the Laptev seashore and Greenland's continental shelf. The distance at that time was only around 1,100 nautical miles. The Trans-Arctic current between them today runs at a rate of about 2 nautical miles a day. Upper Paleolithic mariners paddling could easily have made that trip in less than a year, including daily bivouacs on all the microcontinent formed by Severmaya, Zemlya, Franz Josef Land, and Svalbard. This study shows Franz Josef Land, which is 192 islands today. All the brown is the present-day islands. But at the LGM, all of the white and light blue areas were dry land. Now, the paleoclimatologists have determined that that area, or all of the Arctic, was desert-like at that time, too dry for precipitation to have formed glacial ice, to have snowed and therefore accumulated as glacial ice. And they've identified areas deep in the Arctic, all around the Arctic Circle, that were never glaciated during any glacial period for the same reason. It was interesting to see. This study puts all these solid gold areas at zero depth, i.e. sea level, during the LGM. The Fram Strait between Svalbard and Greenland was closed by a glacier at around 19,000 years ago, and being cut off from the North Atlantic, except at very great depth, caused the Arctic Ocean to warm. And apparently that warming during that period accelerated the melting of the ice on all of the fringes, all the continental fringes, Greenland, the Canadian Arctic, and Norway. The new study by the glaciologists have also determined that the Greenland glacier was much smaller than previously thought, as much as 35 or 40% smaller than they thought. And that some of these Arctic islands, as I just mentioned, were never glaciated. All the brown and tan areas on the left side of this map are by the University of Copenhagen, were ice-free at the beginning of the LGM. And much of it is now underwater. On the map to the right, all the green and brown areas were ice-free even as the LGM was ending. And look at how much of that land that was occupied during the Pleistocene around the British Isles is now underwater. This bathymetric study shows land bridges and currents that cross the Arctic and the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic during the last ice age, all of which would have aided any east to west migrations by land and or by sea. Even after the LGM had ended, as recently as 10,000 years ago, the continental shelves of the Canadian Maritimes were land surfaces exposed to the air, which is what subaerial means. So all the green areas on this map were dry land. All the gray areas are 100 meters or less below the present-day sea level, and so they would have been exposed to the air earlier in the cycle. So trans-Arctic routes probably were viable for human migration. Studies by palynologists show that the Arctic was vegetated and with many plant taxa during that time. Several sites above the Arctic Circle have yielded graveyards of Pleistocene mammals that ate that vegetation and were eaten by carnivores, or that starved, or that became miniaturized and then died out as the Ice Age ended. They were marooned on those islands because of sea level rise. These boneyards are at Beringia in Siberia, Kotelny Island in the Laptev Sea, and Wrangel Island in the East Siberian Sea. A few sites above the Arctic Circle also have remains of shellfish and marine mammals. So trans-Arctic routes would have been possible. I think people and animals came at different times by different routes relating to climate change, beginning well before the LGM. And it's possible that people were reaching the Western Hemisphere from the west and the east at around the same time as people were reaching Australia, more than 50,000 years ago. Climate change would have been a major driver of these routes as the Westlerian continental glacier grew and the Barents Sea froze over, the Kara Sea froze over, and Some animals and people skirted the continental glacier to the south, going west through the Urals. Others became trapped at the outlets of the rivers that they lived on, and those rivers all flow north into the Arctic Ocean. Tundras and permafrosted freshwater bogs along the coast of Siberia became refugia for them. Behind them were vast frozen glacial lakes and ice-capped mountains. This meant that the north-south seasonal migration routes of the animals were disrupted, and subsistence resource procurement was disrupted. The plants and animals expanded their ranges into the exposed Siberian continental shelves and microcontinents, and people followed them into the Arctic. The people were extended families of hunter-gatherers, and they would have followed one, they would not never have moved en masse because they were living as bands, but they would have followed one another into the Arctic to maintain their cultural rules for band exogamy and kinship reciprocity. There would have been profound displacements. People from Central Asia could very easily have turned up in southern France and Spain. They were definitely in the Laptev Sea and in the Arctic archipelagos and in Beringia. And further migration would have been stimulated by competition for shrinking living space and increasingly scarce resources. Later, people would have left again to avoid the catastrophic flooding of those same rivers, those rivers flowing north into the Arctic Ocean, when the ice dams broke as the Earth warmed at the beginning of the Holocene. So if this happened, who were they? And where did they come from? And this is the research that's being provided by the Russians and Scandinavian and German scientists and some North Korean or South Korean scientists. And that is, and they have their own names for people that are different from our classifications. They have ancient Northern Europeans and ancient Paleo-Siberians as the two divergent populations in Siberia during their history. And they were modern people because so far we have no pre-modern skeletal evidence in the Western Hemisphere. They came from the Ice Age refugia all across northern Eurasia. They're sourced to the Altai region in central Russia. And their ancestors, the Altaian ancestors, came from the Amur River Valley of China and the Lake Baikal region of southern Russia. And according to the Russian reconstruction of the history of their continent, they feel there's disagreement, but they feel there were at least two and possibly three divergent populations who migrated at different times by different routes. And the first migration to the Western Hemisphere probably had to have been from Southeast Asian ancestors before the last glacial maximum, simply because of the genetic evidence, which I'll come to again. And it's actually the last ice age that was from Beringia. So, and here's what, this is from, I forget if it's Vasily or Vladimir or Mikhail. They're all either Vasily, Vladimir, or Mikhail. But according to Sikora et al., using his last name only, this is how they parse it. And again, do this. They say that Americans split from Asians 43,000 years ago, that nobody was living in the Siberian Arctic during the LGM, but only before and after. That the only place, if you happen to be in Siberia, the only place to go as the LGM approached was into the Arctic. Your other routes were cut off. And the feeling is, or the evidence they have, is that the original population of ancient northern Siberians was replaced by the ancient northern Eurasians and the ancient Paleo-Siberians about 38,000 years ago. The ANEs migrated west, and the APs migrated east. They also point out that Beringians split from Siberians 25,000 years ago. If you put it all together, the first peopling of the Americas could have been from anywhere above the Arctic Circle prior to 22,000 years ago. So this is what it looks like. So there's the ancient northern Siberians. Their ancestors came from here, the Amur Valley here, and the Lake Baikal region here. So there was migrations north, and then this was the Altai population that split. They split into the ancient northern Eurasians about 38,000 years ago, and at the same time the ancient Paleo-Indians. One group went west and the other east, and both groups got here. Here's the route from the Laptev Sea through the Arctic archipelagos. Here's the Beringian route, and here's the European or North Atlantic route. So is there any evidence for this? And there is, not enough, but there is some enough to continue with the hypothesis, certainly. There is evidence of human occupation of the Arctic before and after the last glacial maximum. This includes a lot of mammoth kill sites and with evidence of butchering. For example, the Kotelny site in the Laptev Sea includes a bone and ivory manufactory dating to 45,000 years ago or more. And as climate change melts the permafrost up there, I have to consult, online every week, and every weekend there's another discovery. They've found something else. So there's a lot more evidence to come, and it's needed because there are gaps. For example, there are no pre-Holocene archaeological sites in Svalbard, the Spitsbergen area, and that would have been a way station on any east-west migration route. These artifacts are from Dioptai Cave. This is from the mammoth manufactory on Kotelny Island. And these are the types of evidence that we have so far. And I'll come back to this last point because Clovis or pre-Clovis is a pretty basic question that we have to figure out. Are you surviving this so far? Now, this is Dioptai Cave. It was originally excavated by Mokanov and Fedorosiva back in the 70s. It's on the Aldan River in Yakutia, which is a feeder of the Lena River, and it empties into the Laptev Sea. Dioptai was widespread. It dates to between 35,000 and 11,500 years ago. Its link to America is debated, but its principal feature is the first appearance of microlithic tools outside of China, including microlithic cores, flakes, and blades, which is also a feature of some of the earliest assemblages in Alaska. Dioptai people were AP people, those ancient Paleo-Siberians, and they were the ones that were migrating east into Beringia. The ANE people that were traveling north and west were mixing their genes and their technologies with Northern Eurasian people, other Northern Eurasian people in Western Eurasia and Northern Europe. And they were acquiring gravation and epigravation tools from the Northern Eurasian area. And I don't know if, well, maybe you'll see these actually are very similar to the pre-Clovis tools that we find here. Diagnostic of the gravation tools are polyhedral or pyramid-shaped cores and unifacial prismatic blades. These assemblages are northwestern Eurasian epigravation, and the archaeologist Ludmila Kaminska also identifies secondary flaking along the edges, shallow shoulders, and basal thinning as characteristic of this style, and characteristic also of many pre-Clovis assemblages. But before we do archaeology, let's just do genes. Do we have any evidence for this? And according to the population geneticists, and I struggle to wrap my mind around a lot of this data, Native Americans have unique ancient Northern Eurasian haplotypes in groups Q, R, and X. Now, if Q, R, and X walked into the room together right now, I would not recognize them. I have no idea what the Q, R, and X refer to, except that they're genetic signatures. I'll just take their word for that. These are, they're ancient and they're different from the Beringian genotypes. They source to the Altai region, and they could have come from the group, the divergent group, the ancient Northern Eurasians, via the Arctic and Europe. And here's what the geneticists say, and depending on who you ask, there are 2 to 4 different male or Y DNA haplotypes, nuclear DNA, and between 4 and 9 mitochondrial DNA haplotypes, mtDNA, female. The ones called X2A and D4H3 are unique to the Americas and occur nowhere else in the world. The genetic evidence, and again there's slight disagreement here, it calls for 2 or 3 separate gene flows at 2 or 3 different times. And according to the geneticists, of course, the only theory they have is that everybody came from Beringia, so they assume that also. But they point out that there was very little gene transfer after divergence, and that this also is reflected in linguistic diversity, language diversity. They also point out that there are mutually exclusive genetic differences between northeastern North America and all the other Native Americans that could be accounted for by migration from the east rather than from Beringia. And here's an example. This is for Y-DNA haplogroup R1. Volkov, I think he was Mikhail Volkov, traces it to the north flowing rivers that I've been talking about, such as the Yenisei and the Angara. And my blue arrows that I added to his map suggest Eurasian migration routes from those Ice Age refugia in Siberia, both north and west around the continental glacier and across the Arctic. This is an ice-free corridor. This is an ice-free, all throughout the last glacial maximum, this was an ice-free corridor to the Laptev Sea continental shelf. And here is R on a geographic distribution map. This is Lewis. I'm sorry I didn't write down anybody's first name, Lewis. This is showing the geographic distribution of Y-DNA-R. As you can see, it suggests a transmission route from Western Eurasia and Northwest Europe. The distribution in North America matches the distribution of the Proto-Algic language, which was ancestral to Algonquian and other languages. And those connections are significant because people tend to talk to each other when mating, one hopes, sharing languages as well as genes. So it's interesting that they, tie in. This is a contrast. This is Y-DNA-Q, nuclear DNA-Q. It uniquely reaches 100% only in the Americas, but it appears to have been transmitted via Beringia from Eastern Asia. It also suggests 3 distinct migrations. The 30 to 60% distribution, the second darkest purple, pretty much matches the distribution of both Algonquian and Athabascan language families. I'll come back to language in a second. This is a dendrogram that shows the evolution of Y-DNA-Q. The descent of Q in America is in red, and the descent of Q in Sweden, Norway, and the United Kingdom is in yellow. You can see that they share a common ancestor, which is orange. We don't know who that is, but the ancestor of orange is that northern Altaean stock that was in Siberia. So who were those orange people? They were, I think they were the, the Sikora's groups, ANEs and APs before they diverged, and that they were the common ancestors of those these blood groups. So if we look at that from a linguistic standpoint, the parsing of American languages is still very much debated, especially if anybody here has gone into that, especially because of Joseph Greenberg's invention of Amarant as a linguistic category. But Greenberg's theory, Greenberg and Rulin, their classification is still the best we have to work with. To me, the distribution of Algonquian language speakers today looks to be consistent with an ancient northern Eurasian source traveling east to west or across the Arctic. These language families are classified as all descended from Proto-Algic, and there are interesting implications because the speakers are concentrated on both coasts, and they include language isolates. Beothuk, for example, is spoken only in Newfoundland, or was. And the Ritwan languages like Kootenai and Washakan and Salish and so on, they were only spoken on the west coast, very isolated communities. So were the Beringians speaking Proto-Algic and carrying their language from British Columbia to Newfoundland, leaving no artifacts in between? I don't think so. And also the historical linguists say that Ritwan and Kootenai and so on were being spoken on the west coast before the Beringians got into the area. The Beringians were speaking languages ancestral to Athabaskan and Na-Dene. So it's more likely that the Proto-Algic speakers spread latitudinally across northern North America, east to west, coast to coast, and then were later replaced in most places by these Proto-Athabaskan speakers, spreading north to south, leaving remnants of language isolates on both coasts. The history of human population movements, I learned, shows that people prefer to migrate roughly around the same lines of latitude. This is true for herd followers and for gatherers and for farmers, because the plants that people depended on are specifically adapted to latitude as well as to altitude, and herds have seasonal north-south migration routes that repeatedly and predictably continually cross and recross the same lines of latitude. Celestial navigation also relies on latitudinal settings. This map shows the link between Yeniseian and Na-Dene. Yeniseian is one of 4 Paleo-Siberian proto-languages, and Nivik is another one that's spoken in the Amur River Basin. And one of the Russian scholars in this field, Sergei Nikolaev, has argued that Nivik is related to the Algic languages, including isolates like Wakashan. And if that turns out to be true, then Proto-Algic could have come from the west via Beringia, as well as from the east, but at a much earlier time than the main Beringian migration. But I have every confidence that at some point the genetic and the linguistic reconstructions are going to come together and give us a good picture of just what happened and when. There's also physical evidence to reconcile, including dentition. Native Americans tend to be cynodonts, reflecting Asian ancestry. And cynodonty has 3 very distinctive features that are diagnostic. They have shovel-shaped incisors, a single root on the upper first premolar, and 3 roots on the first lower molar. Now the gene for shovel-shaped incisors is called the EDAR gene, and it's linked to other traits, coarse straight hair, and a change in the evolution of breast milk. This change in the number and arrangement of ducts for breast milk provided significantly more nutrients to nursing babies. And the better feeding of babies alone would have provided enough of a selective advantage to have caused the spread of this combination of traits, especially during the last glacial period. So this evidence from teeth was really just a byproduct. And the only reason we know about this now is because the archaeologists have been men much more interested in the evolution of teeth and blood and sweat than in the evolution of breasts. But let it be known that the evolution of breast milk was a major contribution to the survival of our species in the Northern Hemisphere during the Pleistocene. Thank you. I had to get that in. So this is what they say about teeth, which I understand a little bit better than I do the genetics. The Beringians were cynodonts with those other Ice Age adaptive traits. But there is another dental pattern called sundodonty. And this has completely different features of cusps and roots. Kennewick man was a sundodont, and some South Americans were sundodonts or are sundodonts. So not everybody traces to Beringians, whether they were incubated or otherwise. And the sundodonts probably were part of the earliest migrations predating the LGM. This is the proposed sundodont migration theory. The Asian part of the route was later replaced by cynodonts, except for the Ainu, the Aboriginal population of Japan. Sundodonty is supporting evidence for the early migration from Southeast Asia to South America. And it's at this point when I came to Kennewick man, who was really a very recent migrant, and I realized I needed to try to connect what I've learned so far with archaeological evidence. So now we come to stones, stones and bones. So this was my second set of research questions. Who were the people who came, and who the so-called Pre-Clovis people? Where are the Pre-Clovis sites? What is Pre-Clovis technology like? What is the Western STEM tradition? Who created Clovis, and where and when? What was there back migration? Can we call Clovis a civilization or a macro culture? So I wasn't off the hook. I had a lot more that I had to find out. But we have to say, I think everyone here would agree that the Clovis first proposition is dead. We have such an accumulation of evidence for people having been here before Clovis. Efforts to avoid this reality are reflected in progressive efforts to redefine the Clovis line, which years ago used to be 10,000 years ago, then it became 12.5 thousand years ago, then it became 13.5 thousand years ago, and I hear there's now an effort afoot to have Clovis begin at 16,000 years ago to account for new evidence. To me, this is naughty, or a no-no or something. A lot of the sites don't even have Clovis tools in them that would be included in the definition of being Clovis. So here's what I learned about pre-Clovis people. They probably came before the peak of the LGM. I found 88 pre-Clovis sites, and there are probably more. There's probably more like 100 because of the way they're classified. We sometimes find as many as a dozen actual sites within a complex, but it's only the complex that's given the name and so on. So the counting of them is loose. Their tools to me looked most like Northern Gravitian in the way they were made. And here's some examples of some of the sites that I read about. Most of the earliest ones are challenged, either for the archaeological interpretation or for the date. The dates often are based only on paleosols or on animal skeletal remains or on charcoal. The ones with asterisks were dated from charcoal. And charcoal, as you may know, is very notoriously variable and difficult to attribute because fires come from many sources. A lot of the dates have been reconfirmed, especially in the pre-LGM range of 60 to 22,000 years ago. It's not impossible for modern humans to have been in the Western Hemisphere before them. There is simply no evidence for it at this time. There's a few more. With the addition of the Deborah L. Friedkin site in East Texas, the ones I've shown are the ones with non-Clovis human evidence dating to 15,000 years ago or earlier. Examples include these pre-Clovis artifacts from Monteverde in Chile, Dilhay's site, now dating to 18.5 thousand years ago. Pre-Clovis from Deborah L. Friedkin on the left, the Galt site on the right. These are in the so-called Buttermilk Creek complex in East Texas. Waters and the other guy, I forget his name. They date to 16,000 years ago. The Clovis tools overlie these pre-Clovis strata, but they appear to be technologically unrelated. These are from Albert Goodyear's Topper site in South Carolina, dating to 20,000 years ago. Pre-Clovis from Parsons Island in Maryland on the left. Jonathan Lothrop told me that he's been getting 20,000 years ago on his charcoal samples there. The pyramidal or polyhedral cores, these are very diagnostic. These polyhedral or pyramidal shaped cores for striking flakes. Prismatic blades. On the right are utilized flakes from the Page Ladson site in Florida. This is a mastodon site dating to 15,000 Val BP. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania from 12 to 19,000 years ago. It also has Clovis-like tools in more recent strata. This is one of the very few sites in which Clovis directly overlies pre-Clovis. Cactus Hill, Virginia. The pre-Clovis levels span 17 to 20,000 years ago. I think that the Mid-Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast are the two best candidates for the birthplace of Clovis. More on that shortly. I arranged my 88 sites to show the distribution geographically. It suggests 3 different migrations of pre-Clovis people. The earliest from the west all the way to the southern tip of South America prior to the LGM. Then one from the east concentrated in the northeast at the beginning of the LGM when anybody in the Arctic would have left there. And next, the timing of the third wave of migrants after the LGM, the Beringians, which overlaps with the advent of Clovis in America, a huge influx of people from Beringia during the Younger Dryas and the beginning of the Holocene. You probably know about the Younger Dryas. It was a 1,000-year event that ended the last ice age and began the Holocene. It involved dramatic climatic disruptions that are attributed to an explosion in the atmosphere over north-central Canada. It was supposed to have liquefied the Laurentide Glacier, set fire to the terrains, and caused massive flooding. This has also been known as the black mat theory, referring to a soil horizon of burned organic material and deposits of iridium. Another recently discovered meteorite strike in Greenland is being considered as contributing to the rather sudden disappearance of Clovis, at least in the north. There is about 1,000-year discontinuity between Paleo-Indian sites in the north and the Archaic period people who followed them that would be thus accounted for. But the Canadian impact created this Lake Agassiz, which drained catastrophically twice into the surrounding oceans. And the cold, fresh water raised the sea level and changed the current, temporarily causing a return of ice age conditions. And there's the place of the Greenland strike, just recently discovered, that I just learned of in the Hiawatha Glacier. And that may become part of the story as soon as they figure out the age and composition of that. They're just investigating it now. So because of this, I rearranged my data again to show the distribution of pre-Clovis sites in relation to climate change. And it again shows 3 migrations: before the LGM, during the LGM, and after the LGM, 16,000 years ago. Wave 1 came from Asia and spread down the Pacific coast. Wave 2 came from the Arctic Circle and spread down the Atlantic coast. And Wave 3 came from Beringia in massive numbers and occupied all the interiors. They all shared common ancestors, but had diverged, and their populations possibly recombined wherever they met, accounting for the extraordinary genetic diversity we find in the Western Hemisphere today. So here's how I think it went. Wave 1. Now, these people didn't go latitudinally, they went north to south, and that's because of the mountain chain that runs down the entire coast of the Western Hemisphere. Their descendants moved latitudinally into the mountains and the plateaus to their east in Mexico and Central America. And their move inland meant making biological adaptations that are present in Native American populations today, such as high altitude adaptations. And of course, they had new subsistence resources that they would have to get used to. Then, before the peak of marine isotopic stage 2, different people come from the east, across the Arctic, across the North Atlantic, continued down the Atlantic coast of North and South America, with evidence as far as Uruguay. Their descendants also moved inland. They went, and possibly even all the way across the continent. Wave 3 descendants, let's see, am I skipping things? There's Wave 3 from Beringia. They come down the coast and also down the ice-free corridor east of the Rocky Mountains, down to the Gulf of Mexico, around the Gulf, and back up the east coast, according to the evidence we have so far.
Is this 22,000 years ago? This we have right there?
What, the Beringians? No, 68,000 at the earliest. And later. These other ones would have been beforehand. Beringians were really the last ones here. And here's their descendants, and their descendants would have filled up the continent, and they would have been involved in back migration. They could easily have carried Clovis back up to Alaska. And Beringians occupied as far as Venezuela in the southern part. So then, as I say, I think the most likely sites for Clovis would be in East Texas, on the Gulf of Mexico, or in the Mississippi Delta and Louisiana area, and then spread northward in these 3 bands of diffusion: east up the Rockies, back up to Alaska, up the Mississippi, Missouri rivers, and up the East Coast. And of course, there were spreads southward as well. The technologies by 11,500 years ago, or 13,500 years ago, included Western stemmed in the west and Clovis in the right. They were not particularly related to each other. They did not derive from each other. Here's Western stemmed on the left. Damn. Clovis on the right. The Western stemmed are from Cooper's Ferry in Northern California. They're very different technologically. Neither appear to be derived from the pre-Clovis tools. And they don't appear to be derived from each other. There's great controversy and discussion about this in the literature. It's every day there's a new article proposing one thing or another, but the consensus is developing that There are precedents for Western stemmed in Siberia, but there are not precedents for Clovis. And there are not precedents in East Asia for the pre-Clovis tools. So that's what they are coming to now. Of course, there will probably be a long time before they completely settle the question. So who were they that created Clovis? The Beringians did not bring Clovis with them to America. The Northern Eurasians may have. Either that or the early Paleo-Indians on the mid-Atlantic coast developed it, or on the Gulf of Mexico invented it, either with the Beringians or before coming into contact with them. And on this last point, let me just say that Clovis occupied the whole continent in very short order, and it's been suggested that this represents, therefore, a macro culture or a civilization. But the main point about Clovis is that it was a major technological breakthrough, and historically, in all societies, technological breakthroughs are adopted by everybody without necessarily adopting each other's cultures. The technological breakthrough of Clovis, I think, was the design. You have a wide, thin biface with secondary flaking and a fluted base. This design reduced friction. When you plunge your spear into your beast, it allows you to withdraw the shaft for another stab. And if the point comes off inside the animal, it allows you to rapidly remount another fluted point on the same shaft. This was a technological breakthrough. Necessarily require that people share the same culture in order to share the technology. A present day analogy, do you know anybody, I mean, even a bushman has a cell phone. If they don't have a cell phone, they have a radio, and if they don't have a radio, they have a bicycle. So you have certain technological breakthroughs that end up being distributed or universally, either through direct contact or through the diffusion of an idea or a meme. And then you end up with people sharing this technology. Certainly, ultimately, there might be some convergence of culture simply because you're using the same technologies together. But it doesn't mean that there was a universal culture. So that's. And I don't think Clovis points were created by the Solutreans. These are Solutrean artifacts on the left, and on the right is the famous Sinmar artifact that was found underwater off the coast of Virginia and dates to around 22,000 years ago. To my knowledge, to date, no other Solutrean type tools have been found here. You see the characteristic laurel leaf shape and the overshot flaking. These are the Mesa Complex artifacts in Alaska. These were proposed as being the progenitors of Clovis, but there are fully developed Clovis sites on the East Coast that are as old or older than the Mesa Complex. So that doesn't work either. Jonathan Lothrop identifies these sites as the earlier Middle Paleo-Indian sites with Clovis in the Northeast. And they include, for example, Bullbrook. On the left is Bullbrook 1, on the right is Bullbrook 2. The original collection was curated by Brian Robinson and is housed at the Peabody Essex Museum at Salem, and they are a sight to behold, should you be allowed to see them. What people often don't realize is that even though we're talking about fluted points, there was tremendous variation in that style. For example, here's Vale Deebert, which was in Maine and Nova Scotia. Mishodinaponset throughout New England and the Canadian Maritimes. Datic Sugarloaf from Deerfield, Mass. But look at the variety. There's quite a lot of variation there. Then you have St. Anne Varney, found in northern New England. Agate Basin, found in northern Great Plains. These were seasonally migrating bands of hunter-gatherers. They were speaking different languages. They were coming together periodically to marry and to hunt communally and to trade. They were making similar adaptations to similar environments, but I am not sure that I would want to call them a civilization. So in closing, finally, let me return to the people I believe came via the Arctic Circle. I see them following the circumatlantic Caledonian Appalachian terrains, shown in yellow here. Those mountains run from Svalbard to Morocco on the east and from Greenland to Florida on the west. They would have risen above the glaciated valleys of the last ice age. And mountain ranges related to them came down the northeastern coast of Canada to Newfoundland. Late, middle, and early upper Paleolithic people could have come to North America via those Arctic archipelagos from anywhere. Refugia on the Cantabrian coast in Spain, as Bradley would have it. From the Shetlands or other British islands, the Norway coast, Ireland, northern Greenland, and they could have crossed the Arctic Ocean, the Norwegian Sea, and the North Atlantic. In addition to being possible, there is supporting evidence from various fields, and such a theory would explain the distribution of the different technologies, the genetic and linguistic variability of the people, and the unique genomics of the Northeast itself. This is the Appalachian Trail picking up from Greenland to the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, Quebec, the Niagara Escarpment, the Great Lakes, Canadian Maritimes, New England. The mountains and the grooves left by earlier glacial retreats and all the glacial erratics would have showed them the way through these terrains. These are in Svalbard, Iceland, Norway, Greenland, Scotland, and Newfoundland. And those mountains were karstic, metamorphosed limestone, very rapidly eroding into caves and very easily dug soils. These are in the UK, Newfoundland, Quebec, Kentucky. And there's the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia. And here are the eastern pre-Clovis sites, going south on the Appalachian plateaus, Piedmonts, and coastal plains. And that's as far as I've gotten so far in my investigation. Thank you for listening. Yes?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for trying to synthesize all of this, because there is so much coming out. It's very hard to keep up with it.
Oh, it is.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to say, those of you who are interested in the DNA piece of this, we're also very lucky to have somebody taking over the musings column in the journal, Greg Paris, who knows that area really well. And he has an article that tries to explain some of the genetic aspects of this in the current journal. So take a look at that to fill out that side of the equation.
Thank you. Yes?
Did you run across any genetic information on the Arawaks and the Caribbean
The Arawaks have some African genetic markers. That's the only thing I know about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
In genetic testing recently, people from European ancestry have 2 to 3% Cro-Magnon. Now I wonder if you go over to the Native Americans, if that is similar, or would that be different?
Native American genomes have European genotypes as part of their makeup, and Europeans have Siberian as part of their makeup also. So there's a general sharing. But I think you were referring to Neanderthals as being 2 to 3%.
Yes.
Not the
yes.
Cro-Magnon, right? Anybody that is not from Africa or Australia has Neanderthal genes. That's my understanding. Other question? Yeah.
We heard a talk a year or two ago about in Los Angeles, a long time ago, there was evidence of, they dug up mastodon bones that had been twisted and pounded.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the.
Well, it's probably on my list. You know,
That's the Cerruti.
that's the Cerruti. Okay.
Yeah. Cerruti mastodon site.
Right. And those mastodon sites are very, I think they're very compelling. They
Yeah.
clearly show human activity
Yeah.
It would be nice if we had more artifacts and human skeletal material from those sites, but
There was a recent article contesting that one as well.
yes, yes.
No, that article is complete.
They're controversial, those early sites. There are some sites that get dates for 100,000 years ago, which is a little scary, really, because then you are talking about people who might possibly be Neanderthals. And maybe that's where we'll come out, 10 years from now when we resynthesize again. Who knows? Yeah?
Where do you put the work of Gustav Guessing?
Sorry?
Gustav Guessing?
Well, he's first proposed the concept of a circumpolar road. And when I saw that, I realized I wasn't crazy, that yes, it is a concept that there would be, a circumpolar cultural collectivity there. Is that what you were referring to? Yeah. He wrote back, in the 1930s?
About that time.
Yeah. So I thought that was a very useful concept. He was ignored for a very long time. Now I think it's generally accepted. The living people today certainly are all part of a massive culture relating to the fact that they all live on or above the Arctic Circle. And if people have other things that they want to ask or question, I'm happy to hear about it.
Thank you.